It's just so wild to put this extreme new moon combined with it being the solstice at the Galactic Center, squaring Saturn-Neptune at the end of their cycle, and Three-Eye Atlas showing up at the same time. I mean, that's just like, wow, that is like so off the charts.
Hello and welcome to the Radiant Astrology Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Caudill. And today's episode, we're coming to the end of 2025. So that means we're headed toward the winter solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere. And a lot is happening with Venus, Mars, the Sun, Saturn, Neptune. So, to help us make sense of all of this, I've invited one of my colleagues and dear friends, Gray Crawford of Gray Crawford Astrology, to join me today. Hi, Gray. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice to speak with you in this time of darkening as we head to this solstice. And yeah, it's a really powerful solstice coming up and turning over of the calendar year as well that comes after that. It's very powerful astrology for sure to talk about.
Yes, and as we were talking about earlier, I am a Capricorn sun, so this is my time of year. I love the darkening of the light, and also, the solstice is actually the welcoming back of the light because we enter that sort of turning point from the darkest night.
Yeah.
And so, one of the first things that's interesting is when we have a solstice or equinox. As we know, there's a chart that, we cast a chart as astrologers, and that gives us a glimpse of some of the major themes over that coming
Mhm.
season. And so it's when the sun ingresses the sign of Capricorn. I want to kind of just make that clear, just because, maybe some people who are newer to astrology, they
Yeah.
think, oh, the solstice is always December 20th or something, but the date itself can actually change because it's more about when the sun, it actually goes to 0 degrees Capricorn. I think that's something important to mention. And, actually, I was wanting to hear from you a little bit more, Gray, because I know you're very steeped into mythology, and so this time of year, the Saturnalia is something that the ancients really honored, and as we know in Western astrology, Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn, and so this is very much sort of like that Capricorn Saturnian time of year. And so, tell us a little bit about like the sort of Saturnalia fest.
Yeah, that was a festival in the Roman Empire era, but there's also thoughts about how it goes back further in time and connects to some other things like in Greece as well. But yeah, one of the things about the Saturnalia that and really putting Saturn at the forefront of that is that there would be this statue of Saturn in the main temple that normally had its feet bound with wool, and they would sort of like loosen the bounds, loosen the binding of that wool, and there would then be this sort of corresponding loosening of structures and rules and greater liberty, like slaves being able to enjoy banquets and having greater free speech, like able to be more disrespectful and everyone being able to gamble, and just this sort of like loosening and dissolution of the normal systemic structures and
Restrictions
rules
and
and stuff.
things.
And so yeah, it was a really interesting at this really powerful, charged moment of the year, which that's one of the things about the solstice and the tropical zodiac that you and I both work with, because there also is the sidereal zodiac people may be familiar with, like in India, that's primarily used, and that's a little bit more lined up with the constellations. The reason that I've always really liked using the tropical zodiac is this exact thing that we're talking about, which is that zero Aries is marked by that exact spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, when we have equal day, equal light all the way around the world. And then the sun starts climbing to its greatest height at the summer solstice, and right at that point at the summer solstice we have the sun goes into zero Cancer, we have the summer solstice, and then the sun comes down. We get next equinox, equal day and light. That's when the sun hits zero Libra. And then what happens is the sun is coming down. And so by saying the sun's coming down, this is related to declination, which relates to more like our celestial equator on our planet, projected out into space. We say the zodiac belt is like the ecliptic, like that sort of, it looks like the path of the sun, and we're tracking things across that ecliptic. And planets can be up and down in that range of like the ecliptic. But when we're talking about declination, that's related to the celestial, our equator. And so if something in high declination is up high in the sky, if it's south declination, it's low in the sky. And so people may notice, just if even if you don't know astrology, you've probably noticed the sun's really low at the solstice. And of course, in ancient times, and which going much further back in time than when Saturnalia was taking place, ancient times, they would have been so aware of the movement of the sun. There's many, there are special stone structures like New Grange, for example, where they're built even where at the summer or winter solstice, they'll vary, but sometimes it's when the sun is rising or when the sun is setting. There'll be like um, rays of sunlight will like shine into like inner chambers, which it could be something with ancestors or graves. But I mean, these things were built in alignment with it. And in the modern contemporary times, there's so much going on. People don't always notice it as much, but you've maybe still noticed that, and it would have been very obvious to ancient people. At the solstice stands for the sun standing still. And if you're noticing always when the sun's rising and setting and where it is at the winter solstice here in the northern hemisphere, zero Capricorn, the sun is extremely south. So it's rising in the southeast and setting in the southwest. At the summer solstice, it's opposite over in the west, and at the equinoxes, it's just like due east, due west, right? So that's also a way you can kind of mark that. And the sun also appears to stand still, like it stays in the same place for several days as it reaches this sort of greatest depth. And you'd also, it's obvious if you're in a place where, especially here in the Pacific Northwest where I live, we get extreme darkness. Like we have so much, the days become so much shorter and the nights become so much longer, and that keeps like right now it's getting more and more, less and less sunlight, more and more darkness. But then again, it seems like we're kind of then at a stasis of it staying the same, but then we start getting, soon after the solstice, we start getting increasing light and the days start growing longer. So this would have been, I think, so we can even feel it now. And you can really feel it as soon as you really tune into it and align yourself with that sense of increasing darkness and then this rebirth of light, and even the sun, this idea of like the sun standing still and this sort of centering um, and turning of a whole season coming in. And so it's really just the energetics of that is so powerful. And then to also, like with Saturnalia, there is just this big, collective festival of, there's a holiday, nobody's working. They're not, the courts aren't in session, so there aren't judgments coming down on people. There's no declarations of war, right? There's free greater liberties in speech and gambling and like hijinks and slaves banqueting. There's a whole like loosening. There's kind of like a collective, almost like discharge and loosening of energy and roles as we're natural creation is turning over. It's very much a point of like the eternal rebirth, that things go dark but then the light returns, and like this sort of eternal regeneration is that we can track. I like to think about that even with like a new moon going to a full moon, the end of a lunar cycle having that kind of quality of like darkness and increasing light. And we can look at that with planetary cycles as well, and planets come into a conjunction and start a new cycle together. So that whole phenomenon, there's something really potent about that with the winter solstice, especially coming into Capricorn, just because it's at a time of like extreme darkness and then return of the light. And so it's really just a sacred time to honor and really going, deep within yourself, what needs to be let go, and really powerful for setting, coming into a sense of like the intentions you want to be coming into contact with for the whole year ahead. So yeah, it's always a powerful time. And then this year in particular, there's things lining up with it that we can talk about that are really interesting with just the astrology
Yeah.
on top of that.
I love hearing you say that because, I've just moved to Western Virginia a few years ago, and before that, I mean, I'm from Florida, where it's
Yeah,
like it's the same,
it's the
you
same.
know, like weather, like almost all year round. And then even in Atlanta, where I lived for many years after that, still an
Too.
extreme. Once in a while,
Yeah.
there'd be an extreme ice storm or whatever for like a week, but here we get all four seasons. We just
Mhm.
had like all of the leaves turning all these
Mhm.
bright like reds and yellows and orange and
Mhm.
everything. And now, we just had a snowstorm, so everything's like blanketed in snow.
Uh,
And I love looking at the history of these traditions that in times when it would get dark, that's when we would have these, bringing in trees from the
yeah.
outside, and they
Mhm.
would actually put candles on them. I can't imagine how many homes might have like gone up in flames, but because they wanted to bring the light, because it was so dark, they wanted to bring the light inside, they wanted to bring the nature inside. And now, and all through Europe, they have those Christmas markets, which now are becoming like really rampant with, international visitors because it's all over YouTube. All over Europe, they have these, markets where you can get like the mulled wine, and it's festive and, holiday season. I always think of the festive holiday season as very Sagittarian. But then when
Yeah.
we get into the, Capricorn season, to me, it feels more that reverence because,
Mm.
whether or not people are religious, it can be a great time of that inner light, that like honoring the spirit, honoring the um, what you have when you don't have nature in full bloom. We have to sort of turn inward. We have to kind of pull back energetically. And yeah, and I love what you said about with Saturnalia, especially the part about like, the slaves could be disrespectful. I think because the respect is really so important to Capricorn, that to have that moment of like that release of, having the tables turned, right? Because I think also
Right.
the masters had to be, I don't know if they were enslaved or whatever, but they had to change places with their slaves. But
Yeah.
um, and then the fact that this time of year, in this particular year, it's so interesting because we have a new moon in Sagittarius, like literally, what is it?
Yeah.
Hours before
A couple of days, like more
oh,
like
is
a
it a
couple.
couple days? Okay, let me see.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
gonna
it's really
share the
close.
chart.
So the solstice, I believe, is the 21st, and the new moon in Sagittarius
Okay.
is the 19th.
And I have the chart here.
Oh, cool.
We've got, let me see if I can put it like that.
Cool. And this is so people could even see this on, if this is on like a video.
Yeah, I think they'll be able to see. Hopefully, they'll
Nice.
be able to see if I'm doing it right. You can see December 19, we've got a new moon at 28. So, very close to the end of Sagittarius, 28 degrees Sagittarius, with Venus at 24, Mars at 3, Capricorn. And so, as you said, we've got the sun 2 degrees from moving into Capricorn, tropical Capricorn, making it the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. It's summer solstice in the southern
Yeah.
hemisphere.
Yeah. So
And
that's, yeah.
and just to say that, like, when we look at, so we have the new moon that oftentimes, in astrology, we love to look every month at the new moon. But the fact that very shortly after we have the solstice, which itself has its own chart, which is more about, again, the main themes coming over the
Mm.
next like 3 months. that, are important to pay attention to as well. But go ahead. What were you going to say about the new moon
Oh,
cycle?
yeah. No, that's important what you're just saying. And I'm realizing when you asked me about the solstice, I didn't follow up about those ingress charts. But yeah, another thing with astrology and mundane, like you were just saying, is those cardinal points. I was mentioning like the equinox and solstice points. When the sun enters those signs, you can cast a chart, like you're saying, and then get a sense of the astrological themes for where you live or the country where you live. Like if you wanted to figure out the USA, you'd cast a chart for Washington, D.C., like the capital. But you could you could also just cast a chart for where you live and see what that's going to look like there, and that's going to give you a sense of the next like 3 months, up into the Aries ingress. And although it's most common for astrologers to cast a chart for the Aries ingress and use that to forecast a year ahead, I know that people that are into the Uranian astrology that do a lot of that symmetrical types of astrology, if you're familiar with those systems, like they will actually I've seen some of those astrologers, they will actually use the Capricorn ingress to forecast the entire year ahead because it is that point of like peak darkness and rebirth of light. So they have their own kind of way of looking at it, but there are some astrologers that will give it that much importance.
Oh,
And
okay. I
so
didn't
bec
know that.
but in any case, you definitely can use it for the next like 3 months. And so for that to happen right after this new moon. But again, it's especially so powerful because as the sun's coming into the solstice, it's already, kind of standing still. It's this peak darkness in the northern hemisphere. Of course, in the southern hemisphere, we're talking about the summer solstice. If you're listening to this in the southern hemisphere, you're well aware of that. But for us in the northern hemisphere, the new moon lining up with the winter solstice is just really powerful in terms of this peak darkness. When the new moon, we can't see the moon in those days surrounding the new moon. We have a cycle ending and a cycle beginning, and we this new moon's lining up with an entire turning of the season. So it makes it in those ways a much more extreme type of new moon quality. There's really intentions you can be setting for this that could stretch all the way into the spring. And it lines up really well even with that idea of setting New Year resolutions, because like I was saying, there's a certain frame of thought you could think about how this could even go for like the whole next year, even. The other thing that's quite amazing when you were showing that, if people are familiar with the idea of the Galactic Center, which is this very mysterious topic in astrology. There's some astrologers that like to get real excited talking about it. I know then it's always not clear. Like people are like, what does it actually mean though? And I know like someone like Philip Sedgwick's done a lot of work with it. And he's someone that is a good reference to check out Philip Sedgwick's work and his site. You can always read some stuff that he says about it. But essentially, I don't honestly understand how you figure out the mathematics of doing this, but essentially, if you're projecting the galactic center, so the galactic center, right? Our sun is the center of our solar system, right? And our sun is so important. This is what we're talking about, this rebirth of the sun, who's the center of our solar system. But of course, our solar system is part of a great galaxy. And at the center of that galaxy is a supermassive black hole, which has been named Sagittarius A. And we now know, galaxies all have something like this, some kind of supermassive black hole that plays some really important role in having this deep well of gravity that's maintaining orbital structures, was really kind of part of the creation, influencing the creation of the whole Milky Way. So this is essentially the Milky Way. So we're talking in a way about now, instead of the lunar nodes being like the intersection of the moon's orbit with the ecliptic, we're jumping out to almost like how does the Milky Way galaxy itself, which is, I mean, we're already going into like this mind bending, far out place of thought, even starting to contemplate, but this intersecting with our ecliptic, and that degree is said to be around 27 degrees of Sagittarius, and then 27 Gemini is like the anti-galactic center
Oh,
point.
I haven't heard that, but that makes
Yeah, so we're talking about sort of lining up somehow with like the center of this much greater galaxy we're part of. And you know what? One of the things that this makes me think of is Three Eye Atlas, and what an incredible phenomenon that we are experiencing right now, where we have this strange object, which is an interstellar object, right? Three Eye Atlas is like
Is this
beyond
the
even our
comet
galaxy.
thing?
It's a comet. It's beyond our galaxy, right? It's an interstellar object. It's from some place. I mean, the little information that we've been getting so far, I've heard people saying like, well, it's probably from some place that's older than our galaxy. It's already had its closest point to the sun, but this is what's really wild is about this. So comets are always messengers. They tend to be disruptive. They're very Saturnalia vibe actually, because comets have a history of going with like throwing world leaders into, you know, a leader falls or like an empire falls, or there's some kind of big change in leadership or rules, or you know they go with some kind of, they marks often are an omen of dissolution and change. And this is an interstellar object from somewhere even beyond our, you know, Milky Way galaxy. And it's actual, what they're saying is the day that Three Eye Atlas will be closest to us on Earth is actually December 19th. So on this same day as a new moon that's aligning with the galactic center, um, this interstellar messenger is going to be closest to us on the exact same day, which definitely to me speaks to some kind of omen about um, just how wild this turning of the year is, and all of the astrology that's coming in the year ahead, which has this quality of evoking at least a feeling of this whole new era opening up. And you know, things like UAPs or UFO, you know, there's all this stuff about that that's really alive in the collective now. More and more people talking about topics like this idea of like what's out there way beyond us. While at the same time, there's all these like really concerning things happening just in our own places we live in
Oh.
our own world and national and local governments. But
Well, another thing that you
yeah,
had pointed out too is that at that time, the 26, 27
mm,
Sagittarius, we
yeah.
said 27. I always known it as 26 Sagittarius, but I think it's,
It
does it
it
move?
might be. It's pretty, it might a little bit. Yeah, it's basically right there, 26, 27.
Okay.
It might be more
Um,
26. I've seen 27. It's close enough.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I would recall it as 26 Sagittarius,
Yeah.
at least from when Philip Sedgwick was writing about it. But and yeah, that's so interesting because the other thing that was in this solstice chart is that we've got that you had pointed out. Let me just share it real
Mm,
quick. Where's the solstice? Okay, that Venus will be at 26 Sagittarius. So on
yeah,
the 21st, right? So we've got the new moon, which is within that, like 1 or 2 degrees of it. So it's essentially conjunct that galactic center degree. And then you've got Venus coming in there. And the whole thing, all this is being squared, is squaring Saturn at 25 Pisces and Neptune at 29 Pisces. So
right.
essentially it's the midpoint, and midpoints are very powerful too.
Mhm.
The midpoint of that conjunction is square this whole
Yeah.
galactic center point with these planets going through it. So I find that interesting. And you had said that because when you cast a chart for like a solstice, it's going to be different, for the location and everything like that. But there's certain, obviously, the planetary aspects will be the same. But you had
Yeah.
mentioned that if we want to consider this chart has some significant themes for the next 3 months or maybe the next
Mhm.
year. We want to look at that Venus square Saturn Neptune. I'm also noticing Mercury's at 13 Sagittarius.
Yeah.
And you know what that is? That is the great attractor,
That's a really good point. I wasn't thinking of that, but that is also true.
14 Sagittarius.
Yeah, and
Another Philip Sedgwick.
Mercury is squaring the lunar nodes. Mercury is ruling the south node and is at the southern bending, at the degree of the moon's southern bending, squaring the lunar nodes. It's also really close to where you and I are talking soon after a Gemini full moon that was on December 4th that was squaring the lunar nodes. And so Mercury's kind of right at that point again at the solstice. So,
So
Mercury.
I'm looking at December 19th to December
Mm,
21st. Um, so many of these things are aligning, especially then you mentioned this comet is going to be
yeah, yeah,
activating
yeah.
things on December
That's
19th.
just a whole nother that's kind of going a more mind bending part, but I think it speaks to me of like there's just something really powerful on this unknown level of reality that we don't something is going on that's like much larger that then
I
there's also
will
just what's
say,
happening in our own life. It's just but there's
and
also
yeah,
some
our own
bigger
lives
thing happening.
personally.
Yeah, but yeah.
I will say that why this stuff holds water to me, the Philip Sedgwick, the
Uh-huh.
great attractor and the Galactic Center
Mhm.
is, in my own just those degrees do seem to kind of come up in
Mhm.
these mind-bending type of themes, and there's also a lot of famous astrologers throughout time and in modern times that have either ascendant at 26 Sagittarius or sun at 26 Sagittarius or something like that. So to me, there is something to do with, maybe it's some kind of beyond, the our normal insight, an insight into the universe in some way. And so let's
Mhm.
start with this Venus square Saturn Neptune, and
Yeah.
that being, say, a significant aspect for this season ahead. We associate Venus as a Capricorn. First thing I think of is money, obviously, like money and resources, and
Many
also our
resources.
relationships, and also
Yeah.
significant female figures too. All of
Mhm.
these things could be part of the story, but a square to Saturn Neptune, the Saturn Neptune has been a lot to do with the dissolving, right? The
Mhm.
dissolving of structures and, what we rely on to sort of be structural support in our lives, our society. So
Mhm.
what kind of signification do you give to that? The Venus square?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about it that you went into there that's so important is that Saturn and Neptune right now, as we're talking, are ending a cycle and they're going to start a new cycle on around February 20th. Probably depends a little bit about your time zone, but February 20th, they form a conjunction in the first degree of Aries, which is another one of these cardinal points. That's like that point of spring and increase and just that symbolism alone, as we're talking about these ingress cardinal points, just sort of signifies this is a really unusual, extraordinary Saturn Neptune conjunction that is beyond the norm. That's much more powerful than normal. And they're always really powerful. And they always go with collective reality shifting and changing. And sometimes it's new technologies coming in, sometimes it's empires falling. So there's often big popular insurrections and rebellions of people that happen as well. There's actually some themes like the Saturnalia type of thing about things getting shifting and changing when they come together, and there's often also great collective uncertainty and despair, and that Saturnian sort of melancholic expression can get dissipated in a Neptunian way through the collective. There can be really difficult things like inquisitions happening and um, literal and metaphoric witch hunts, all things that we dogmatic, self-righteous, religious, crusading and persecution, all things that are clearly going we have these things all happening. So there's a really difficult part of Saturn Neptune and there's a part of Saturn Neptune where it can feel really difficult for people because even though we can feel how things are changing so dramatically, and sometimes the changes are really sudden, like the last time they came together, the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down. In China, there was a great Tiananmen Square demonstrations. That particular one got crushed. But things can happen that are just really unusual. The one before that in the early 50s was when the television era was really coming in, and civil rights movement was starting to get some more momentum, and things that were like led into things like the Brown versus Board of Education ruling soon after that conjunction. The one before that in 1917 went with like the Russian Revolution. The one before that, like in 1882, is like the dawn of the electrical age and electricity coming in and city blocks getting lit up with electricity. And, we think about how having electrical lights just change our reality and our relationship again to darkness and light. And so it's always really profound. And so this is going on.
I did want to say
Yeah.
one thing where you said this because
Yeah.
in our summit, which we had this
Oh yeah.
summer, which was awesome, and you really knocked it out of the park with your presentation. And one of the things you said was that the best way to kind of prepare for all these big changes, especially with Pluto and Uranus and all the Saturn Neptune, is to know that there's going to be things that are not within our like conceptualization even right now,
Yeah,
and
totally.
because, as astrologers, we like to say like, okay, maybe this will happen or maybe it'll turn into this. And but we're referencing what we know, you
Yeah.
know? So I think that's what the only way we can maybe emotionally prepare is the difference
Yeah.
from when they had, light bulbs from no light
Yeah.
bulbs to light bulbs I mean, just
Totally.
imagine the time when there was a time before we had mirrors. It was like a
Yeah.
lot of human history without any and then when mirrors came into our consciousness and it started proliferating, it became the world became a lot more to us human centric and like the human body and just us being the center of the universe, which I think before they said that we were a lot more kind of in tune with nature and like we were
Right.
part of this whole ecosystem until kind of said, "Hey, I look great. I should be at the center of everything." Or that kind of
Yeah,
that
yeah,
morphed with
totally.
reality.
I think of that with the electrical age too, really changing things with electrical lights. Yeah, and even with like the mirroring of like the television era coming out of that one, and like then all everyone starts watching TV at the same time, and then the last one was also like the World Wide Web coming out of that, and this last cycle has been so much about the internet, which then even got turned into we all have our little screens and phones that we're carrying around. That's also tracking all our information now. It's a whole, but
And if you've ever like looked at someone else's feed or like their social media feed or something on their phone, you're like, well, like even my husband is like lives in a completely different world than I do online,
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. With
yeah.
what you see, what you think reality is. Yeah. So these are all we had earlier this year in especially in July, Saturn and Neptune got really close together in Aries, but they didn't quite come together. Then in recent months, Saturn went back into Pisces in September, Neptune went back in October. Now Saturn is direct as you and I are talking. Soon after you and I are talking, Neptune will station direct. And so by the time we get to the solstice, Saturn and Neptune are both moving forward in Pisces, moving, heading out. Like Neptune will go into Aries later in January, and Saturn will go into Aries around like February 13th or something like that. So we're coming to the very end of their time in Pisces, and they're in this balsamic phase, which is the ending phase, which is a phase of like dissolution and darkness and kind of clearing. And that syncs up with it being the solstice, time of increasing darkness and rebirth. It also lines up with it being a new moon because a moon right before a new moon is balsamic, ending a cycle. And then even it being lined up with the galactic center also goes with it because really the galactic center we could think about it. What does it mean? I mean, it to me just amplifies the dissolution and this letting go of the way things have been,
And
confronting
I
your
think
Mm,
Someone also said, like, power, we may feel powerless. I feel like
mhm.
there's a powerlessness at times when we've got, with the Neptune, especially at the end of Pisces. But I think the good thing is we have had a little sneak peek, of Neptune and Saturn and Aries that, like, I'm with you. I feel like we need to go into the releasing of the things that are just not serving us, now or in the future. But on this, when if we are overwhelmed with those feelings of powerlessness or hopelessness or helplessness, that might be part of this purging and this processing. But hopefully we know that there's another cycle that's about to begin. So not to be too overwhelmed with the hopelessness, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that thing where within the darkness, you can find your center. Also, we like to throw on that term like, oh, they're going through a dark night of the soul. But when we're saying that, there tends to be, this dark night of the soul and this dark passage, this sort of underworld passage of which ultimately lets somebody reorient and reconnect with something really essential, finding that center within you, not unlike even if thinking about like Polaris and the circumpolar stars that, in the night sky, we can see everything revolving around. There's something even about like, this is a galactic center. Everything's revolving around this supermassive black hole. The other thing about this that's quite powerful with both this new moon and Venus, which I'll talk more about with because you were asking about Venus squaring. So Venus is basically really activating the Saturn Neptune, but that new moon that happens right before Venus does it on the solstice, that new moon in Sagittarius on December 19th is also moving from a square with Saturn into a square with Neptune. So we get this new moon on the galactic center activating Saturn Neptune. And what I mentioned before about at the solstice, the sun gets its lowest declination. If a planet goes out of bounds, it means a planet is um, beyond the range of where the sun goes in declination. So this Sagittarius new moon is actually extremely out of bounds in southern declination. So this means it's this untethered, unbound new moon that's like really extreme, which to me is it's just so wild to put this extreme new moon combined with it being the solstice, squaring at the galactic center, squaring Saturn Neptune at the end of their cycle, and Three Eye Atlas showing up at the same time. I mean, that's just like, wow, that is like so off the charts. So to me, it's like it just makes this really supercharged solstice for any. I mean, so it's really a time, like you were saying, to one of the things with Saturnalia as well as those other festivals you mentioned, they would often be lots of like lights and lighting up candles, or like you mentioned, like bringing in the tree and lighting up the tree, and there's many things that some people out there may already be doing, whether you realize it or not, that goes with this idea. But you could also be more intentional about really connecting whatever you can do to get within yourself. Because with Saturn Neptune, you're saying how it makes people feel powerless. There could be something like you wanted to have happen. You had this dream, this really idealistic thing you wanted to do, and you're realizing it's just not working out the way I was hoping. It needs to shift. That's a typical thing with Saturn Neptune. That doesn't mean you just totally give up. It means you have to find another, there's a change happening. There's something else for you to be coming into a relationship with. That new moon's really powerful. And then, like you said, on the solstice, 2 days later, Venus is right at that galactic center point, and Venus is activating Saturn Neptune. And then the other part is that Venus is also dark. She is invisible. She's too close to the sun to be seen. So it's not just that Venus is squaring Saturn and Neptune, which we would think about, like you said, there could be a sense of like our desires, our resourcing, the way we, it is something that can go with like money and mercantile things, but also Venus is so much about relationships and creativity and making things, our aesthetics and our style and how we present ourselves and how we arrange things and what we want to create and unify in our life. this is having to come into some kind of confrontation with the Saturn Neptune dimension of how things are fundamentally altering and shape shifting in such powerful collective ways. And we're all having to orient to it. But to me, this, because this is all happening at this really powerful solstice time, this really is about like going deep within to contact, what is it about yourself on this deep level that needs to be shed and released and let go of? And what are these deeper desires that are coming up right now? It's just really heightened because Venus is also, she's moving really fast towards the sun. So she's going to, in the new year, she's going to form a conjunction with the sun. It is on January 6th, which is also kind of amazing because that in the Christian, that gets the day of like Epiphany and like,
Epiphany, yeah.
yeah, there's lots of magical things about that particular day, and religious. But she'll be reanimated on January 6th, and there'll be like a new Venus coming in, like a new moon. So it just because that's happening soon, but not quite when we're at the solstice time, and she's squaring Saturn Neptune. I mean, there could be a lot of disillusionment people are going through, and if that is something you're going through, it's just really gaining faith that you're going to be able to contact something within you that's going to become this guiding light forward, and there needs to be a confrontation with something within you, that sometimes in Jungian, Carl Jung's work, and the people talk about the shadow and the self, and what can be powerful about that kind of work is there's things about our deep self and our subconscious that we're not owning or claiming, and it can come out in different ways, and really getting in touch with that and doing what you can to work on clarifying what is it that you really do want. I mean, that's actually a much more difficult question than people typically realize, and trying to really use this time to gain greater clarity for that, so you can come into this year ahead, which, like we're talking about, has such dynamic potency. There's so many cycles coming together at the same time, cycles that go with things in the past, like you were saying, like another one would be not Saturn Neptune, but just some of the other cycles coming together, like the heliocentric revolution, and just our complete orientation to the world changing in such powerful ways. I don't know if we're going to have that level of things in 2026 for sure or not, but looking at the cycles, we seem to be entering a period of time where things like that could likely be happening. And we can see there's certainly things with technology that are changing fast. So we don't know where those are all going yet, or what's going to pan out or what's not going to pan out, but
Right.
something's
Well,
going on.
and
Obviously.
definitely the yeah,
Yeah.
and as you
It's
said, the
like,
Uranus sextile
oh yeah,
with
that's another
Saturn
one.
Neptune,
Yeah,
because
Uranus sextile.
Saturn Neptune on its own, when you have the dissolving of Neptune, of the structures of Saturn, and
Mhm,
them going from that, Pisces, the water element, where we, again, may feel more of the sort of the overwhelm of the dissolving, into the fire of Aries, which I feel like is like going on a crusade, or
mhm.
something
Yeah,
like everyone's gotta like pitch in and do their part to create this to get this new cycle going or whatever. And then not only do we have all the energy of that, but as it's sextiling Uranus, now Uranus has dipped into the end of Taurus, but it will then go back to Gemini,
Gemini, yeah.
where it had just entered last year. But that whole dynamic of that electrification of boosting, it's almost as like the self-sacrifice, or we get a sense of sacrifice a lot with Neptune, but in a fire sign of especially Aries, the first sign of the zodiac that ruled by Mars, that just wants
Mhm,
to get in there and start get the fires going and things. It's almost like this, and when I think of technology, AI, that AI revolution, that AI,
mhm,
the race,
mhm.
for AI to these different companies to beat each other. Like, did you hear the other day that the head of OpenAI, that Sam, whatever his name is, he had
Altman.
Altman, he sent a email to all of his employees saying it's code red because Google's Gemini is beating them on a lot of things, and people are using it more. People are getting more out of the Google Gemini. And so now the fact that he said code red, it's like that's like
I hadn't
declaring
heard that.
more,
Yeah,
right?
that's very symbolic. Yeah, and national levels too, the competition. That's yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned the Uranus cycle. So Uranus, Neptune, Saturn cycle. So that's the thing about 2026. It's so powerful is I mean, even if all we had going on was that Saturn Neptune conjunction of first degree of Aries, that would just be amazing to me. But it isn't the only thing we have going on. So we have Pluto's recently in Aquarius. Uranus was in Gemini for a little bit last year, but Uranus comes into Gemini. It's going to stay in Gemini in April. Neptune goes into Aries, will stay in Aries, not come back to Pisces in January. Saturn goes into Aries in February. And this next in the northern hemisphere summer in especially in July and August. And then they come back in relationship later in the year, like in November, I think it is. But we start getting these exact aspects between these outer planets and they create this really powerful configuration. And that's just for these outer planets to come into the exact degree and minute aspects is really powerful. And especially for them to all do it at essentially the same time, like in July, especially, like they're all happening within days of one another. And this is Saturn and Neptune have separated at that point, but we get Uranus and Neptune, like you just were mentioning, exact sextile. And so we just did have one on November 20th with Uranus at the end of Taurus and Neptune at the end of Pisces. And this is so that's the one that has already come in before next summer, but it's still what's really powerful is at the same time that's happening, Pluto in Aquarius comes into an exact sextile with Neptune in Aries, and Pluto in Aquarius comes into an exact trine with Uranus and Gemini. And then Jupiter comes into Leo and connects to all, like threads the needle, weaving in
Wow.
between all of them. So Jupiter's comes in and like sets off the whole thing, which is the classic setup that Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche really drove home with that book is these moments are especially powerful when we have these great outer planet alignments and then a faster moving planet like Jupiter comes in and sets them off. That's typically when we see something. The reason astrologers are so hyped up about this year, and even like the really famous mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau made a really big deal about this configuration coming because it's just a really unusual one that for them to all come together. And so this Uranus Neptune cycle you mentioned. That goes back to they formed a conjunction in 1993. So those people listening may have that in their own chart if you're born around 1993. I know you and I were graduating around the time of graduating high school or coming to the end of high school in 1993. That was
I was
a
a freshman in high
oh,
school.
you're a
Yeah.
freshman in high
I
school.
think no,
Okay.
no, no, no. Sorry. 90. Okay, I graduated. I was graduated high school in
Yeah.
94.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
94. Yeah. You're
Mhm.
coming to the, yeah. Yep. I graduated high school in 93. That's why I was saying that. Yeah. So I was going from high school to university in that time.
Wow.
But the
Okay.
90s were such a powerful time, and that was a time of Uranus and Neptune coming together. And one of the things about that I think is interesting with the Galactic Center is there was 90s did have a lot of innovations and thought about the significance of things like dark matter and the fact that everything really is made up of this dark matter. I think it's like close to 95% of everything actually is. And it kind of goes with the power of this, supermassive black hole at the center. And Uranus Neptune, that sextile, which also is essentially it's in pretty close range of that solstice chart you were showing. In the solstice chart, Neptune is still pretty close to a sextile with Uranus, and Saturn is coming into a sextile with Uranus. Uranus combined with Neptune especially really is that I don't know, just for some reason, the Barack Obama campaign slogan just came to mind, which I don't really want to uh, bring up with this, but it is like when you talk about the audacious hope, like the human capacity to have this hope and you know the power of like the human imagination and the power of like the true, the good and the beautiful, and the power of our imagination to like give shape to our world and create, whether that's through poetry or imagination or scientific technology, that we can, create a better world. There's a very like utopian quality, which, there's also this side where like, how do we what about that idealism can really actually even come into reality? And obviously with Neptune and Uranus and Saturn, we can be misled by our idealism about where we think these things are going, and there's unintended consequences to the world with what it is that humans are trying to create. But and Uranus can, of course, be really disruptive and shocking, but it does also have that liberating quality to it. And so, one of my hopes with Uranus coming into the harmonious alignments with these planets could be that hopefully there really is something freeing and liberating in positive ways that come out of this time period. I mean, I know that with some of these technology things you're mentioning, that is one of the high hopes, the idealistic hope about it, that it actually does do something positive in those ways.
Well, the interesting thing is, like you said, that the trigger planet sounds like it's Jupiter in Leo, which
Yeah,
I think we
absolutely.
could use some positive Leo because with
Yeah,
Pluto going into Aquarius being sort of the opposite, almost like, taking the energy from the Leo archetype, and spreading out because the Aquarian energy tends to be, the not one person is special. We all have, everyone should be able to have a voice and everyone should be equal, and that's great too. But I think human nature does, I mean, we need every archetype on some level. And I think, um, at least on the positive side of Leo, if hopefully Jupiter can bring that hope, like you said, audacious hope,
yeah,
I think that's something that really seemed to be missing, especially since I would say since 2020. Like how
yeah,
because we almost don't dare to hope.
yeah.
We think that we don't want to be, like you said, misled, or people just don't have it in them to
Mhm,
feel optimistic or
mhm,
expansive or even to really indulge in anything that's entertaining or enlightening
mhm,
and things like that. Hopefully that can help with that sense of expansiveness with,
mhm,
all of these planets. Because I just had S.J. Anderson on, and he talked a little bit about Andre Barbeau's that
mm.
index with when the planets
Alright.
in
Yeah.
his time, those were the outer planets that were, I guess when they're expanding out, then you have more of a golden age energy. When they're contracting is sort of like that dark time. And they contract
Right,
the most around 2020, and they're
right,
supposed to be expanding
right.
around that time you said, June, July of
It's
this
it's
year.
the exact time. Yeah, that's the thing with Barbeau, and he had used that to he was one of the astrologers that way ahead of the time had predicted the possibility of like a pandemic in 2020. And then he was extremely optimistic about this alignment. And that's the thing. I know it looks really dire with a lot of things going on in the world, with what's happening with current events. But when, somebody like Barbeau, who's really devoted his life to this, just looking at the cycles, he was like, 2020 looks really, I mean, the way he described 2020 is not lines up really well with what happened in 2020. And he had sort of he had a very opposite interpretation of what worked this really powerful lineup in 2026. Both lineups are so like you could have if you were I know in ancient times or further even just a few centuries ago, they weren't even aware of Pluto and Uranus and Neptune. But if you could have been aware of them, you could have like a long time ahead of time pinpointed like 2020, 2026. These are just 2 points that are really extreme with in different ways. And so, yeah, hopefully, because yeah, Jupiter and Leo, there's a lot of the research I've done into that. There's a lot of creativity that can come with Jupiter and Leo. There's a lot of really innovative things that have shown up with it before. So,
Yeah, and I also,
I'm really hopeful with
Leo can
that.
be the arts, artists,
Yeah, exactly, especially
Hollywood,
with arts. Yeah.
yeah, things like that. Anything creative or
Mhm.
um um I mean, I we do want to watch those, like of course the dark side of Leo I often think of as, those narcissistic characters are the ones that are
Yeah.
so brash and bold and self-centered or whatever. But I feel like the magical glamour side of Leo hopefully can get enlightened too. But you're about to have a course where you're going through all of these major transits of the year, aren't you? Coming up
Oh,
soon.
yeah, I am. So, if people are interested in learning more about all of these transits and the cycles coming up, I have a course called Mapping 2026 where I'll have there'll be weekly live classes, but then I'll be sending out pre-recorded videos also like ahead of each class, and essentially it will help you get a sense of these bigger astrological transits coming and how it's going to impact your chart, as well as how to learn how to just come into relationship with what does it mean to have a transit happening in your chart, especially with Jupiter and Saturn, and then especially even more. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So there'll be a lot of extra focus on this really what we're just talking about, these really powerful alignments of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto with Jupiter and Saturn, and how to get a sense of that for the year ahead. So yeah, if people are interested in that, you can find out more information on my website to sign up for that.
I'll have the link in the show notes too, so they can sign up.
Yeah, awesome.
And yeah, because the magic and beauty of astrology is how these moving planets in the sky actually activate our own charts and our own lives, right? There could be like something major going on, but if it's not activating your chart, it might not be as big for you. Whereas there's something else, you know,
Yeah,
like activating your
absolutely.
personal planets or your angles or something like that. And then you're especially going to be wanting to pay attention to those.
Yeah, that being said, 2026, similar to 2020, it would appear that even if, like you're saying, "Well, I don't have anything at the exact degrees where this is happening," we're all in this collective together, and it's most likely gonna be the kind of year where there's historical events and things happening where it's just known for this. Like, this is a
We're all
year
in
that's
it.
just we know, like, this happened. Like, 2020, people just associate with, like, lockdowns and pandemic and so on, but it's not gonna be I don't think it's gonna be that. It's gonna be something else. But the astrology 26 at least is very different than the astrology 2020, but it'll be something similar in that, big collective events that this year is likely forever known for. Certainly, that's the type of quality of time we're coming into this with the transits, and so, yeah, that's the benefit of starting to get an understanding for what is that and how can I relate to it and how can I orient and plan ahead as best I can.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what it's like for people who don't follow astrology because I think every astrologer, I mean, I knew for a fact that 2020 was going well, I personally didn't know it would be like a pandemic, but I thought it would be like the Gestapo or so. I mean, I didn't know, but I knew that we would be in some kind of a lockdown situation with Saturn Pluto. I just knew. So
Yeah,
it's the 2019 I went on like 3 trips to Europe, like, just to like, to travel while I could, because I just knew that Saturn, Pluto conjunction, it was actually Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter all in Capricorn. I
right.
knew that was gonna be harsh, and I didn't know how it was gonna look, but, there was no getting away from that. And I think every astrologer had a sense that, yeah, we gotta watch out for 2020. But then, so this coming year, I mean, like I said, the benefit is we've had a little bit of a sneak peek with some of these transits kind of, Saturn and Neptune got very close to a conjunction. They didn't make the exact conjunction, like I think within whatever, some minutes or something. But we had a sense of that feeling of like that whole Aries drive
Mhm.
happening throughout the collective, and so now we're going to have them sort of go through that threshold.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the solstice, like we were talking about, something we didn't talk about as much, but I can just throw in here as we come to the end here that's also important is we mentioned Venus getting really close to the sun and she's ending a cycle. Well, Mars, the sun and Venus are also heading to Mars at the solstice. So Mars is also going to be in the underworld and sort of just like Venus going through this underworld death rebirth process. And in that first 10 days of January, as we start coming into the increasing light a little bit, we get Sun and Venus together on January 6th, Venus and Mars together on January 7th, Sun and Mars together on January 9th. So they all start new cycles together, um, which one way I do like think that personally orienting to Venus and Mars that can be helpful for is, Venus, like we talked about, like what you desire, what you want to bring into your life, unify relationships, and Mars being more like what you want to protect and courageously go after and pursue and fight for. And there's some confrontation of that. It's probably been very deep with like relationships and adjusting within relationships and brings an opportunity though for changes to happen and getting a sense of what you want. And what's really wild is we mentioned that new moon in Sagittarius is out of bounds. Well, Mars is also out of bounds in all of December going into January. Just after the solstice, Venus goes out of bounds on December 22nd. So she essentially forms a square with Saturn on December 20th. Then she goes out of bounds and forms a square with Neptune on December 23rd. And then at the end of the year, Mercury, who is squaring the nodes at the solstice, goes out of bounds on December 29th, right before the new year, which is the same time Mercury is coming into a square with Saturn and Neptune. So that means we get new moon square Saturn Neptune, Venus square Saturn Neptune, Mercury square Saturn Neptune between the solstice and the new year, with Venus and Mercury basically going out of bounds at the same time, which just quickly means like these are just wild, extreme Venus and Mercury. So like there's something like it just seems like it's such an extreme moment of dissolution and letting go of the past and trying to get a sense of what's coming for you and letting your imagination run a little wild with that. Honestly, like to me it does point to like let yourself really imagine what you really do desire and what you want and what you want to create with your life, and really let that be this guiding light for you, in this time of darkness as we come to the end. It's quite powerful, really.
Wow. And I do think that, as you said, when we have these, because the Saturn Neptune, they're essentially, conjunct at the end of Pisces, but these personal planets, a lot of times
Right.
we experience them on a personal level.
Yeah, good
With
point.
Venus,
Hmm.
yeah, Venus, our relationships, our values, Mars, what we're driven to defend or protect, and Mercury, what's on our mind, or what we're
Hmm.
thinking about, our communication. But I love the fact that then in a new year, I think you said like around January 9th, Mars and the sun, it's almost like, how sometimes things will leave our life or will dissolve, and we won't even have much say in it, and we have to process that or grieve that, and then eventually we can get out of bed again, or we can get driven again, and maybe
Hmm.
we're lighter because we have less, weighing us down. And I think that Mars to the sun, I mean, I love it because, it's my solar return and I have Mars right there with the sun, and Venus too. Luckily, hopefully she'll help to smooth things over. But that Mars, Venus, and the sun, and when we think about the sun illuminates, right, what it touches, and it's the central focus. So that first week of January, I have been seeing, it seems like a trend, especially with astrologers, are like, oh, we don't, there's no reason starting a new intentions, a new year, because we're in the middle, it's the winter solstice and it's winter time, and you don't start things until the spring equinox, where. But this year, when you look at the actual astrology of it, I think that having this new fresh, like you said, these new cycles of Mars and Venus and the sun, that really does seem like this new year, especially that first week of January, can be a really good fresh start. And in the sign of Capricorn, things might
Yeah.
not happen fast, but I think with Capricorn, it can be great to think about what's worth building on, what's worth going the distance for. and
I
start
agree. Yeah.
taking the first steps.
For many people, I think that's the case. I'd also say, like you were just saying, if you happen to be somebody that is going through that kind of grief and catharsis and confrontation with having to let go of something, that could also very naturally line up with this and just really let yourself go through that process because we literally are having a death of all these cycles at happening at the same time. And then in that first 10 days, there is a reanimation of Venus and Mars. They won't be visible yet, though. They won't be visible till a little later in the year, but they have at least been reborn by the sun. But so some people might need to like really get like go through that kind of process you're describing. But to keep in mind that what that means is as you're going through that, there really is something coming and to be tracking that and coming into contact with that. I think in contrast or comparison, if you're somebody that isn't going through that and you do have a lot of things coming together right now, yeah, January could end up being quite potent with like, oh, yeah, this is it, and I want to like really set off on this direction right now, and I'm gaining a lot of there could be a lot of clarity for what that direction is coming in. But you might need to basically go we might need to really essentially embrace this dissolution of the darkness of the solstice. That's going to come before the clarity for many people. So just
Mhm.
being aware of that's what's going on and the clarity will come.
I think that there has been a lot with the Saturn Neptune at the end of Pisces, a lot of nostalgia for the
Yeah.
past or nostalgia for the good times or or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe even glamorizing those good times from the past. And maybe that it could be part of it too. It's like wishing things were the way they were or whatever. But at some point, you're not getting any real juice out of that, in terms of what will help to grow moving forward.
Yeah, it's not 1993 anymore when Uranus and Neptune were coming together. We're in a very different time, but
Not even 2011
not even
when
2011.
Neptune
Yeah, I got
first
2011.
went to
Yeah.
Pisces. Those were some good times for me.
Yeah.
Well,
No, it's crazy, yeah, how different even now in 2011 is. That's a good point. It's so different.
yeah, where Neptune is wrapping up its time in Pisces. But I think it's energizing to know that we'll have some more Aries. But there's again, there people from all over the world are experiencing these aspects and things like that from planets and experiencing them in different ways, but because we're so connected and we have the internet, we have social media and things like that, we can see what is going on in different parts of the world. But I think it is important to also to know that we need to take care of our little corner of the planet as
Mm.
well,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
ourselves. But thank you so much, Gray, for coming on my podcast. You're always welcome. I love chatting with you and learning from you. And anyone who's considering taking Gray's course, I highly recommend learning from him. You can visit his website, Gray Crawford, or you'll have the link in the show notes. And so, Gray, I wish you a wonderful Saturnalia
Yeah.
and holiday season.
Yeah, I hope you have a happy solstice and everybody listening does as well and really takes in the sacred quality of this time of solar rebirth. It's gonna be a really powerful time this year.